Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. With our format of the policy briefing, ECO would like to address current policy issues and legislative procedures on national and European level, and we want to contribute to the political discourse. Let me introduce myself. My name is Henning Lesch, based in Berlin, head of the Policy Law and Regulation Division, and I will guide you through. Today, we would like to take the opportunity to address the topic of the Network Information Security Directive and the corresponding Commission draft. The draft directive is intended to replace and update the old directive and adapt it to new challenges in the field of IT security. The revision of the directive will thus redefine the legal framework for IT security in Europe and harmonize it more closely. Among other things, it's planned that more companies will be involved in IT security regulation in the future. In addition, governments are to be given additional options for taking tougher actions against IT security breaches. It's been a while since the European Commission presented its draft revision of the directive, I think in December. In the meantime, discussions on the file already started in the European Parliament. So there's been the first exchange of views between the ITRE committee and with the Commission and member of the Parliament, Krothus, the rapporteur for the NIS Directive, and further milestones have been scheduled. I think until 27th of May, considerations of the draft report will be done, and 2nd June is the deadline for the amendments, and afterwards upcoming is the vote in the ITRE committee, which is not scheduled yet as far as I know. I think it's a good opportunity to deal with the revision of the directive at this early stage. Before we begin, however, a short organizational note. I think you all have been on a lot of virtual conferences, formats, webinars, so you gained a lot of experience in the past month, so I'll keep this short. Please take a look at the slides and our virtual housekeeping rules. Therefore, needless to mention the virtual netiquette. We will try to make this virtual event as interactive as possible. Therefore, we will also give you the opportunity to ask questions. And finally, please note that this event will be recorded. But now to our virtual policy briefing. To start with, my colleague Philipp Ehmann will give us a brief overview of the European Network Information Security Directive and the current state of the legislative process and the present changes that go along with it. Hi, Philipp. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome from my side to today's talk on NIS 2.0. To cut the long title of the directive a little short. My name is Philipp Ehmann, as already announced. I'm desk officer at ECO for telemedia law and internet regulation. And I'm covering the topics of data protection, IT security with ECO. And today we will have a brief view at the Commission's proposal on the NIS 2.0 directive that has been published last December and that has now reached the parliamentary debate. To start, I will cut this a little short today because we all had enough time to read the directive already and get a little bit into the points on what is new through NIS 0.20. Then we will move on and have a short or brief look at what does this mean for the internet industry. And in the end, I will give a short wrap up on what stance the internet industry is taking on NIS 2.0 as it is proposed by the Commission. To get into it, just a small starter, what is new through NIS 2.0? Well, I think most groundbreaking and most general change through NIS 2.0 is that the regulatory field has been extended greatly. This means that now not only essential entities or critical infrastructures, as they're often called, are covered through NIS 2.0, but also so-called important entities. To give a short explanation on what that means, so while earlier NIS was covering things like water supply or telecommunications as critical infrastructures or DNS service as critical infrastructures, now there are also important entities that are regarded as relevant for the public life, but not as critical as those critical or essential entities. This would be, for example, waste processing or social networks, which would also fall under the directive. Now, this is certainly an extension in the field and may also lead to an extended application of the directive compared to what we already have. Also new is that NIS 2.0 now includes a sanction regime that has not been there before. The sanction regime, as set out in Article 31 of the directive proposal by the Commission, is offering either 10 million euros or 2% of the annual turnover of a company or an entity. So we are here quite in a ambitious league as far as the fines are concerned, what fines are concerned. This also goes beyond. There are further sanctions that are more detailed. For example, that it is now possible for the Commission to ask countries to interdict certain persons to operate critical infrastructures. We will have to look a little bit more closely into that once we reach the point. A third change that NIS is addressing is that supply chains are now a little bit more included into the directive compared to before. This is set out in Article 19, where they set out that, for example, when taking into account the building of new digital infrastructures like the 5G network, that the ENISA and the NIS Cooperation Group are now responsible for drafting and devising recommendations to countries, but certainly the responsibility for enforcing and regulating supply chains will remain with the member states. A last significant change NIS directive is posing or presenting is that registries and registrars are now more closely regulated under Article 23 of the directive and are required to identify holders for web domains and are required to provide contact opportunities for holders of web domains on an actual basis. So that also means that the information has to be kept up to date. Now, when we're saying what is new with NIS 2, we also have to look a little bit closer at what is not new with NIS 2.0, or what did the directive proposal now not change. Well, the first and foremost, most prominent topic is that it is a directive and not a regulation. This has been discussed within the Commission when they were making the inception impact assessment last summer. where they also envision the idea of making a regulation out of NIS 2.0. However, they did not follow up onto this, and this also means that there will be not as thoroughly followed upon approach for harmonization of ICT security regulation. So this does set back the idea of harmonizing the approach on ICT security. The second thing that has also not been changed within NIS 2.0 is that there is no harmonized approach on supply chains. They are more included in the regulation, yet still the responsibility remains with the member states to set out this idea. So the idea of enforcing a digital single market, at least in this point, has not been followed upon. So what do these changes mean for the internet industry? Sorry, that was one too much, I think. Yeah. Well, the extension of the regulatory field has or offers the chance to include more companies, but on the other hand, also bears the risk of creating double regulation, which we already can observe in some points. The most prominent case being the EECC, where there is an overlap with the NIS Directive and EECC Article 40. So telecommunication providers are now regulated through EECC Article 40 and the NIS Directive, which includes all telecommunication providers. And there has to be made more clarity on the question on how this overlap can be overcome. A second risk that may arise from the extension of the regulatory field of NIS Directive is the overlap or double regulation within NIS itself through the essential and the important entities. So we, for example, may have the case that a provider may be a cloud provider or a hosting provider and fall under Annex 1 of the NIS Directive, which would mean it is an essential entity, but on the other hand, it also may be a social network provider, which would mean it fall under Annex 2 and being an important entity.
Eco ist auch wieder besser. Hallo, Herr Pohl. Ich rufe an. Ich hatte es schon wieder ein Weilchen her, am 9.4.
Sorry. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. I was distracted for a second. And this means that there is an overlap, and there should be, this is more like a hint and not a clear problem that this regulatory overlap is might create if the regulation for the important and the essential entities is getting into conflict with each other. So we will have to observe and follow up more closely on how the regulation of the important and the essential entities falls out in the further discourse. But here I'd see an open question. Another thing that NIS changes for the internet industry are the reporting rules laid down in Article 20 of the directive proposal. There is now a multi-layered reporting scheme to be implemented, meaning that providers of essential entities are required to report within 24 hours if there is some sort of disturbance or some disturbance that may impact the network or the functioning of the infrastructure. this is the first report that is to be filed, and the second report is to be filed not at least a month after the report has been, or the problem has been reported. So we are here now having more reports to be filed compared to the former NIS Directive, where the reporting requirement was as soon as possible. This has to be taken into account when implementing measures and communication strategies for reporting incidents or security incidents. And also, critical aspect of the information and reporting of incidents is that NIS 2.0 now also includes the connected users of a service. So you are now also, or companies are now also included or required to inform users if there has been a significant disturbance in the service or an attack on the service, and they are to communicate this to the users, which has not been a requirement before. A third aspect is that companies are now facing or being subjected to greater responsibility under NIS 2.0. I was wrestling a little bit with myself on whether I should call this responsibility or accountability. Basically, companies are now required to have a more detailed look into their supply chains, implying that they're still responsible for maintaining a clean supply chain for their infrastructures, and they are also now subject to sanctions. So this also means that if there is something that does not work out the way it should, or there is a disturbance in the service, then this should mean that there is a sanction. The third aspect that is also to be taken into account is that the CSIRTs, the Computer Security Incident Response Teams, are now on the edge of, or are now able to simulate attacks or incursions on ICT systems, and the operators of the infrastructures critical and essential are now also subject to defend against these attacks. So in addition to reporting schemes, and in addition to making clear what kind of service one provides, we also now have to face the fact that national CSIRTs may also go and try and find out if they can snope or get into the infrastructure and attack it. So this certainly means that there is a lot more work to do by the operators of the infrastructures. A last change that largely conflicts with the registries and registrars. I think I put this out a little bit before. They now have to, in addition to the requirements of the NIS 1 directive, develop and maintain a list or a database of who has registered what domain, and they also have to keep this information verified and up to date, and offer a contact possibility for the domain holder. So there will be a lot more administrative tasks to be performed by registries and registrars compared to what we have currently existing in the market. So this certainly will imply that there are in the future more administrative costs to be faced, and mechanisms to be developed on how to authenticate users and domain holders. So to wrap this up, what does the internet industry think and take a position onto this proposal? Well, the first and foremost critical problem that I have already sketched out a little bit is the fact that the responsibility for the integrity of the service is remaining largely with the operators of critical and essential infrastructures. This means that there will be no liability in any case to producers or providers of hardware or equipment, meaning that if, for example, there is a hardware leak or a security leak implemented in hardware, that's properly called, and then the provider of the infrastructure is still the one liable for this security leak and is responsible for closing or fixing it. This implies that the costs are initially to be bared by this instance and not by the hardware provider. The second problem is that the sole responsibility for the hardware provider, for the infrastructure provider is the one that does not solve the problems we currently have or that we currently observe in the market, where hardware providers are actually the source for concern of network security in many cases. So the problem of connected crap on the internet, as some people call it, will remain because hardware providers and user component providers are still not covered properly under the regime. Another problem that I also sketched out already is that through the extension of the regulatory field is raising questions on how to actually implement the regulation and how to relate the different strains of providers of infrastructures are critical or essential or important to each other. We have already observed the question that there may be an overlap in the regulation, but as a matter of fact, we also observe that the different strains that those different actors or classes of actor are to be followed upon is actually falling apart and together, and this is creating a lot of confusion. So for example, when you're an important entity, you should be actually regulated ex post, so you do not required to meet ex ante regulation approaches that the essential entities are to be faced with. However, especially if it falls down on national level, for example, Germany, which is currently passing its IT security law 2.0, those different entities are actually regulated more or less identically, which is raising the question why they're separated in first place. So we do here have a certain extent of legal insecurity. Additionally, we also can observe that there is the legal uncertainty about the ECC on one hand, and the NIS Directive 2.0 proposal on the other hand, meaning that there is a double regulation open, but as far as I have understood, both actors in the European Parliament and the Commission, they are very aware of this problem, and they are also interested in solving it. The idea is basically to annul Article 40 of the EECC, include the regulation for the telecommunication services into the NIS 2.0 directive, which, however, is creating a certain amount of unhappiness within telco providers, which have already complied to Article 40 of the EECC and are now fearing that NIS 2.0 is providing the requirement of additional compliance with new legal obligations. Another question that has also arisen in this case is that there is also another directive in the works that has been published along with the NIS 2.0 directive, which is the Critical Entity Protection Directive. which is largely focusing on the physical protection of critical or essential entities. However, especially industrial companies are very anxious that this directive may fall together with the NIS 2.0 directive and start getting into conflict with it. So they face double regulation on the this phase between the NIS 2.0 and the CEP directive, respectively. This has to be cleared out a little further. From what I can hear about the internet industry and the telco sector, there haven't been any complaints as of yet. However, I also do not know how aware people are of the fact that this other directive also exists. So we will have to wait until the further clarity has been made. These are basically the double regulation problems. The third, and I think one of the most important impacts that we see as an adverse problem of NIS 2.0 is in fact, again, a directive and not a regulation, meaning that national states may also devise national laws on how to implement the NIS directive, and we can currently in Germany see quite live. So the law is getting passed tomorrow through the first chamber of the German Parliament, the German IT security law, there may be future problems on how to construct or implement own networks, because especially if you're looking into the supply chain problematic, it might imply that one nation state or one European member state might interdict the use or implementation of certain systems or components within networks or telecommunications networks, what other member states might not see a problem. I'm hinting here at the heated debate about implementing a certain provider of telecommunication network components from China, which has been the core of a heated debate on whether to use this technology or not. And we are very aware that this is quite a critical problem. A second critical problem arising from this is that these different frameworks might also imply that companies might face different ruling and regulation in different member states, as I already sketched out before. The German IT security law does not as closely differentiate between important and essential entities, and basically subjects both of them to the same regulatory requirements, which means ex-ante registration, which means ex-ante conformity assessments. This is not the intention of the NIS 2.0 directive. However, as the NIS 2.0 directive is simply requiring the baseline of regulation on IT security, this does not exclude that certain member states may certainly go beyond this regulation and apply stronger or stricter rules, just as the German government and the German parliament, as it seems, are following upon. I assume that this might get more complicated when more national IT security laws in the different member states are passed. So the idea of creating a digital single market that also holds true within the ICT security sector, this might imply that this market is subject to a greater extent of fragmentation than seen in other aspects, and in the end certainly may not lead to a helpful solution of creating the European digital single market. The last, and I think also not to be trifled with, problem that we do see through NIS 2.0 is that the CSIRTs are getting a more active role, which basically in first place might seem as not as big a problem. However, when taking into account that CSIRTs now may actively attack critical entities, essential entities, and important entities, and snope for backdoors, security breaches of any case, vulnerabilities. This might pose a problem not only on a technical level. So, for example, if your service is using a certain port for communicating with the user or providing a service to the user, and you observe that there is an attack, so you close down the port and the service is no longer available. So this is one problem arising from this ability. Another problem is more tackling the civil rights aspect, meaning that the CSIRTs are certainly learning a lot about vulnerabilities of services, learning a lot about backdoors or access to information and data of users connected to the service, and it is not really clear how the member states are using this information. So I can tell you from the German ICT security law that has been proposed by the government, where there was a clear passage stating that the German CSIRT, the Bundesamt für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik, Federal Office for Security and Information Technology, were allowed to employ these measures as a CSIRT, but they were not required to report any vulnerability they observed or detected to the operator of the essential entity or the operator of the important entity, but to keep it for themselves if as they put it out, overarching security interests conflict with that. But basically meaning if there is a security institution, for example, a secret service or a police service, stating that they need this special vulnerability to get into services of their own, the BSI, according to the government plans, would not be allowed to communicate the fact that there is a vulnerability, so that the security institutions would be allowed to use it, which again would create the question on who would be liable if something happened with this vulnerability, aside from the fact that the BSI has detected it and not communicated it to the service provider. We have just gotten, like yesterday late, the new changes made by Parliament to this. So it now seems that this passage has been removed, this problematic passage, but it certainly still points out that there is a lot of ambiguity in this passage, and the role on the CSIRTs, which are, in our opinion, to be clarified through the NIS Directive. So there should be a clear statement that these information that national CSIRTs are getting should be in any case relayed to the provider of the infrastructure or to the respective entity. Otherwise, this would mean that there would be a collection of vulnerabilities and backdoors and other problems, so that that could not be closed because national governments would use this information for their own purposes instead of using it to enhance ICT security, which in any case would contrast the very idea of the directive in the first place. So that's it basically in short and from my side, and I'm very glad to hear questions if you have any.
Thank you, Philip, for taking the time to briefly introduce us to the NIS 2.0, what changes come with the update, the current state of the regulation, and yeah, I think it's an excellent overview. Thank you for this. As I mentioned at the beginning, we also want to make the virtual event as interactive as possible. Even though it's a virtual format, please feel free to use the opportunity to actively participate and be it through written questions or also especially through the raise your hand function to ask your question in person. So I would like to open the floor for questions now. And as a starter, perhaps the question, do you have any insights about what is being discussed between European Parliament and the Commission? Where's consent, dissent, and where are the pitfalls? For example, scope important versus essential facilities, and what's the state of play in the ITRE committee of the European Parliament?
Okay, thank you. Well, discussion in the Parliament has only taken up recently because Parliament was arguing amongst themselves which committee it should refer the NIS 2.0 directive to. There has been a heated debate between the ITRE and the IMCO committee. Both wanted to take full responsibility for this, or sole responsibility for this. And now this has been resolved. NIS 2.0 is discussed in the ITRE committee, and there has been a first exchange of views that has pointed out that there are certainly points that seem to be unclear. So when taking into account the role of the important and the essential entities, as I already sketched out, that this might pose a problem, is that even in the ITRE committee, there is the basic idea or approach that important and essential entities are basically the same, and they are basically to be regulated the same. So the idea of the Commission of subjecting essential entities to an ex ante regulation scheme, meaning they have to register, meaning they have to provide evidence that they are in conformity with the current security requirements obligated onto them ex ante. So this means before they're getting into service, whereas the important entities are not subject to this. They should be subject to an ex post regulation scheme, meaning that only in case of a arising problem, they should provide evidence that they are taking efforts on being compliant with regulation. This has this seems to be one of the crucial points actually in the debate, both within the ITRE committee, but also between the ITRE committee and the Commission, because statements from several MEPs are hinting at the point that they do not differentiate between those two at all. This is unresolved basically, and we will have to see how this further develops. So it's really hard to tackle this problem. Another problem that can be seen is on how people are taking the ICT security regulation vis-a-vis the data protection obligations that companies are also still subject of. So we do not have only a network information security requirement, we also have data protection rules. And as we all know, ICT security and data protections often go hand in hand. And it's really unclear on how these rules fall out. Basically, you can see that at the very beginning, or the baseline, the sanction regime, which is putting in quite harsh fines, and many people are asking themselves now, is this ICT security breach sanction regime cumulative with the sanction regime of the GDPR? So this means that you have to pay 10 million euros for being not a secure service, and you additionally have to pay 10 million euros for not being compliant with data protection rules or not meeting data protection requirements. Now, if you're using artificial intelligence and the AI Act, which has been passed yesterday, comes through, may then also accumulate, so that in the end you will have to pay like 15% of your annual turnout as a fine to the European Commission, which would certainly offer the Commission a great amount of money, but on the other hand might certainly also be at a certain point crippling for a company if those fines are actually cumulative. This is unresolved actually, and thus we can not say that this falls out one way or the other. My general stance on this instance would be that ICT security leaks not automatically and per se imply that there is a data breach, and that the fine level, that the sanction regime of NIS 2.0 envisions should be closely revisited, not only in the case of the monetary fines, so the penal system that is implemented through interdicting certain persons to work, or work as the head of an essential or important entity, are, in my opinion, clearly conflicting with employment law. So yeah, there is a lot of open questions to be faced, yes.
Among other things, it's planned that more companies will be involved in IT security regulation in the future. In which sectors and what kind of companies are affected and are in the extended scope of the directive?
Okay. Basically, there's a new annex to the NIS 2.0 directive that is quite comprehensive. So you have the important entities that now also include explicitly include social networks, that now also explicitly include as important entities search engine providers, which have been somewhat opaque in the NIS 1 directive. So there was this trias of online marketplaces, search engine providers, and cloud computing providers. This has been a little bit more thoroughly clarified through NIS 2.0, at least in my opinion, stating that search engine providers and online marketplaces are now regarded as important entities. So they are now clearly covered through this. They also clarified on what is an online marketplace. They also clarified what is a social network, which has been newly included in the NIS 2.0 directive. So I think that these companies are, from an internet industry point of view, to be included. Certainly, there are also things like computer and hardware providers that are now also regarded as important entities. And there is still question on this implies only certain components that are covered, or whether the computer as a whole is included. This has to be clarified through further debate in time. And then there is, of course, the whole lot of things in the important entities that I'm not an expert of, like waste processing or pharmaceutical products in some instance, producers of medical technology that are also now covered. So the coverage is actually a lot more comprehensive than it was before, and reaches far beyond those very essential entities that we used to have in NIS 1, like flight traffic, computer, telecommunication networks, and train traffic, and to a certain extent DNS providers.
Okay. The NIS Directive provides for the inclusion of registrars and registries. What does that mean for the companies?
Actually, it will mean a lot more work for them. The current system basically states that if there's a payment opportunity provided, usually through the registrar to the registry, and the cash flow is stable, then the domain can be operated. If other requirements of the national top-level domain provider are met the specific requirements. This is basically if the directive is coming through the way it is supposed to come through, this is over. It is, from my point of view, still unclear on how to resolve these requirements that NIS 2.0 is posing here. They say that they want to have a firm confirmation of the ID of the domain holder, and they also want a firm confirmation of contact possibility, which in my opinion requires an authentication method that has been accounted for. So this could be video ident or post ident. This could also mean that you have to show up at the TLD in person and file your request for acquiring a TLD. So this is the first tier. The second tier that has to be taken into account is that there is a contact possibility. We do not know whether this contact possibility can be covered through and solely through an email address or something like this provided by the domain holder, or if there are further means of contact required. I think it's too early to actually tell how this falls out. We basically have also to take into account that we still have data protection rules that also TLD providers are to follow along. So data minimization should be a case and an aspect taken into account. And the problematic thing is that these TLD providers are basically required to build up a huge database about persons holding national TLD domains, and who are now also required to follow up on these persons and in certain intervals verify whether they are still valid.
Okay, thanks. As a follow-up, I think you already mentioned it. What implications on personal data do you see, for example, in relation to domain registries?
Just as I pointed out, the registries are to identify the domain holders. So it's not or no longer, okay, here is this bank account and there comes the money from, or, oh, there is the registry that is paying me money and receiving money probably from someone who has registered the domain through the registry and the registrar, sorry, in the end, this implies that there will be a database of persons who are to be kept on retention if they hold a top-level domain. Yes, and this database has to be up to date. I can't tell how strict the rules in the end will be, if this requires the registry to annually check on whether the contact data is still valid, or to do this on a daily or monthly or whatever basis. So this is not clear yet. And the other thing is the way the authentication works is also not clear yet. So just as I stated, might be video ident, might be post ident, might be something else that we cannot foresee yet, some trust service that is to be implemented. EID, I don't know.
Okay, thanks for the explanation. You already mentioned as well the keyword double regulation, and what about with regards to the GPDR and EECC, and further add on here a question, what about the interplay between NIS 2.0 and the Dora proposal? Can there be inconsistencies and overlapping requirements in this area as well in the future?
Pardon you, the Dora proposal?
Yeah.
can't really follow up on what you're referring to.
Okay, so we will figure this out. Come back to this question. Can you have an idea how much between the NIS 1.0 and 2.0, how deep is the difference, and what's your opinion on the change of the identification criteria?
Well, for those entities that are already covered through NIS 1.0 as essential entities, the differentiation is, at least from my point of view, most likely handleable. It could be addressed very well, and it also could be incorporated. The problem is that NIS 2.0 is changing the way reporting is covered largely. So companies which already have these mechanisms in place will have to review these reporting mechanisms to their companies, meaning, until now there has been a reporting obligation ASAP, which means if there's an incident, you have a team on your premises ready to counter whatever the problem is, and they will certainly, if they are required if they're required to report this to the national CSERT body, they will file the report once they have a clear overview on what it is and how it is falling out, which in some cases may take a few days. And this has been changed to the point where companies or entities are now required to report within 24 hours that there is an incident, which also implies that they are now required to report it even though they don't know what the incident is. And the second layer then is that the final report should be filed within a month. So you now have a two-layer reporting system. I think this is one of the greater changes. And the second great change is that you are also now required to inform your users that there has been some sort of attack or incident in any case. So you're certainly required to inform your users through GDPR if there has been anything happening which might include a leak of personal data, but now you also have to inform them that the security has been compromised. I'm still unclear whether this is a very wise or sensitive idea, because as we know, ICT attacks happen all the time, and it's, in my opinion, a little bit problematic to actually relay any attack that is taking place. Another problem is that they should contact them if the availability of the service is concerned, which is, in my opinion, also not the smartest move, because if your service is unavailable, you certainly notice that the service is unavailable. If you can't upload your data to your cloud because your cloud is down, then you certainly see that it's down, and the provider of the cloud now would have the responsibility of contacting you through another mean and inform you that his cloud is down, which you already know. So it really doesn't help. Maybe they could review this passage and more aiming at maybe reducing the reporting to user to actual incidents that require user interaction of some sort. So classical problem, change your password, or make sure that your data hasn't been leaked somewhere else. Yeah. Now getting back to the question with the Dora proposal, digital operation resilience financial services. Well, it's a sector-specific regulation. we do have this also with medical instruments. We now will soon most likely have this also with certain aspects concerning artificial intelligence. I don't know about the interplay on that. So financial services are actually not directly covered through NIS 2.0 as essential entities, and only to a certain extent as important entities, because they usually face sector-specific regulation. So I assume that there might be an overlap and an interplay, but I think it's just the same as the EECC. So this should be relayed to the Commission, and we will certainly also do this and place this topic there and see if this can be harmonized, and so that the regulation remains stringent and there is no overlap or conflict within the regulation.
Okay, thanks for the answer regarding the Dora proposal. I think it might be quite the same as double regulation or overlapping problems with EECC and the GPDR. So maybe we consider the NIS 2.0 as a horizontal approach, and Dora requirements are on top of that, I would assume. What do you think?
Maybe the case. I mean, it's basically just as the EECC. It's a sector-specific regulation, and of course, any given sector might devise or provide specific rules set out in a stricter way than the general regulations, or in this case, directives envision. The problem, I think, in this case is that NIS is a directive and thus not by itself a regulation, and that it only materializes itself through national law. And this means that you have to take into account that different member states may devise their own specific rules. I mean, we are already having this discussion on ICT security with fintechs, and you also see where the bandwagon is trailing. So it used to be the UK, because there was the possibility of quite easily registering financial services. Now through Brexit, it's no longer the UK. I think many of them are now moving to Lithuania. Yeah, we will basically have to see how this falls out. But it's hard to say, okay, we have NIS and then you have Dora, and you can put Dora on top of NIS, because NIS by itself is not regulating. It's only a guidance framework for nation states on how to devise their national legislation. So this is the challenge. I mean, that's basically also the challenge when taking into account the fact that we do see on how these information chains or supply chains are regulated. It's also the nation state that will in the end decide whether a certain component provider is legal or illegal.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I have a further inquiry regarding the domain sector. As domain registrars can also be hosting providers, cloud service providers too. Do you see any issues on potential conflicts regarding Article 23 and Article 40?
It will depend on how the regulation for hosting providers is falling out. I mean, basically, and I think this is quite anachronistic. The regulation, the directive is posing quite specific rules for registries and registrars in this instance, and they are to follow this laying down and to comply with it, whereas the rules for hosting providers are not that quite clear. So there is a hint that they are to meet certain security requirements, but from what I read and understand is that those two different tracks of regulation are, at least from my point of view, not that conflicting. Certainly, we will have to get a closer look into this on how the database is stored and maintained. If this is a hosting problem, then yeah, this might also fall under the directive, even if you are not acting as a hosting provider as a registry. So yeah, this may be subject to double regulation to a certain extent, but not per se.
Okay, thank you. What's the opinion of the industry of the measures per se laid down in Article 18 of NIS 2.0? Do you think the measures are sufficient, or do they go too far? And in addition, the question about the sanctions and the fact that essential services might be suspended. I think it's referencing to Article 29, I think.
Again, it's really hard to tell on how this falls out on national level. If you look at how the German government, for example, I'm now taking this example of the German ICT security law to just sketch out what this means. The German government devised the very idea that both operators of essential and important entities are to register day one, and are also to provide evidence of being compliant with all security requirements this law passes at day one, which is certainly very specific. So there is not legal uncertainty, as many people in the industry often claim. But on the other hand, especially for the operators of the important entities that have not been covered before through a regulation, this would be kind of a problem to actually comply, because how will you be able to comply on day one after the legislation comes into effect with the legislation? There is no like implementation period or something like the GDPR offered. It was like day one scenario, and this also means that these specific rules are to be taken into account. Another problem arises from the fact that these very ideas of NIS 2.0 are placing the ideas of supply chains in national government's decisions. And now we're still working on this from the German ICT security law, where the German government might actually declare certain components as illegal. This means that if you are operating an infrastructure that is using certain components from a certain hardware provider, maybe from China, because that's what all the people are talking about when it comes to this topic, the government may say you're no longer allowed to use these components within your infrastructures and your entity, which basically means that you have to remove all those components that you are currently operating within your infrastructure, which if you are operating a mobile network, maybe not a small one, might actually pose a very big problem. So the first problem being on how do you get this equipment out? The second question is, where do you get replacement equipment from? You need to replace this in order for the infrastructure to work. And the third problem is a refunding problem for the company, because you will certainly face the question on how do I get my money back. So the government won't pay you for removing these components. It just says you're not allowed to use them anymore. The company which has provided you with the hardware was said, I provided you with the hardware you ordered, I want the money for it, and the operator of the infrastructure may end up with an awful lot of money to pay for technology he cannot place on the market and not being able to offer a service. So yes, in this way, I think that the obligations are quite strict and punitive, but this is the way the national legislation has tackled it. the formulation of the NIS 2.0 directive in general is quite open. So this is the problem that you have with the directive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
As it is.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Philip, for the good explanation about the measures. We're running a bit out of time, I think. So we will need to come to the close soon. At the end, perhaps the question, can you give us an impression about the timeline, the upcoming milestones for Parliament, and how or when is it expected that the proposed regulation will become effective in each member state?
I think Parliament seems to be, after a slow start now, quite engaged in finishing the file and getting a parliamentary position ready on the file. As I pointed out, there's still open questions as for the scope and the application of the directive, which will certainly take a few more sessions. I assume that we will sometime in end of June maybe get a committee decision on the file, so that actually Trilogue may start sometime at the very end of the year, depending on how quick the council is moving on the file and taking a stance towards it. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great outlook. What's coming next and when it comes into force. Okay, first of all, many thanks again to Philip Immern for the excellent overview and your presentation about what is the NIS 2.0 directive about, what's the next steps, and what to expect. Thanks for this, Philip.
Yeah, thank you for your time and thank you for listening and taking part in the discussion.
Yeah, and thank you also for your interest in participation. I hope you enjoyed it. I would be happy to welcome you again the next time. Take care and stay healthy.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.